Welcome back to your social studies classroom, 6th grade. It's glad to see all of you with your bright and shining faces. Don't know how I can see your bright and shining faces since this is a pre-recorded video, but regardless, it's happy to be here with all of you. And today we're going to talk about a very low-depth overview of Iraq and Iran. Okay, so where are we going from here? Well, this week we're finishing up and talking about different places' histories. We'll talk a little bit more about the culture of Iraq and Iran. And eventually we'll be finishing up our talk about Middle East and we'll be moving into Africa. But for right now, we're going to talk about Iraq and Iran. And more specifically, we're going to talk about how both nationality and religion plays a role in the shaping of countries. Let's talk about Iraq first. Where do we get the word, where does Iraq come from? Well, the problem is that the nation of Iraq is not a natural nation. What do I mean by that? Well, you look at places like France, and France is kind of a natural nation. They have some different nationalities in there, some different language groups, but for the most part, people who are French have lived in France. And so it was kind of easy as they formed their nation over a long period of time that nationalism, or that belief that in your own country, kind of allowed them to formulate their own nation together. Okay? French people formed together because they had a shared common view of France. The problem is in Iraq, and this is true for a lot of post-colonial countries, is that the borders that were drawn for them are artificial. They are artificial in the sense that they're not borders that are natural. So for instance, in Iraq, you have several different groups of people that are living there. Iraq is one of the older places that people have lived. Mesopotamia has been called the cradle of civilization. And since Iraq is in the middle of that, it has been part of human history since the beginning. Okay? But they were not called Iraqis. There were in those early years, Mesopotamians were different city-states that lived on the Tigris and the Euphrates. As time went on, some city-states became more powerful. So you had eventually some of the more powerful city-states like the Sumerians or especially the Babylonians, who conquered several key areas. Eventually, since Iraq was one of the only major water sources in the Middle East, it became a hotspot for conquest. If you control the rivers, you can control the area. You also can control agriculture because the Mesopotamian rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, were used for irrigation. And so as people went along, they said, let's conquer Iraq. Okay? It wasn't called Iraq back then. Okay, keep that in mind. It was just the different cities of people who lived there. And so different groups would go and conquer, and especially one important group for this discussion is the Persian Empire. Now let's talk about where Persia is. Persia is modern-day Iran. Modern-day Iran. Now, Iran is another one of those nations that is not as naturally forming as others. However, it's a lot more congealed than, for instance, Iraq. Iran is a very mountainous area. The areas that border Iran are mostly mountainous. The people in Iran live in high plateaus. And this has been true throughout history, that people lived on the high plateaus, especially around Tehran, the modern-day capital of Iran. The Persian people, which is what I'll use until we go into modern history, eventually formed the Persian Empire, and they control most of the Middle East. Their empire extends from Afghanistan all the way to Egypt, up through Turkey, and this, of course, included Iraq. Now, the Persians eventually are going to fall away as a result of the conquest of Alexander the Great. And so their empire is taken over by some Greek generals. Eventually, there are several different groups that control Iraq and Iran. Now, keep in mind, these two nations were never thought of as nations. They were just thought of as areas to conquer. The idea of a nation does not really come about for most parts of the world until the 1800s. Okay? So it's kind of hard for us to say, where's the nation of Iraq at this point? Or where's the nation of Iran? They don't really exist. And so, eventually, what becomes extremely important is the rise of Islam. In Saudi Arabia, around the city of Mecca, the Prophet Muhammad is reported to have seen an angel which gave him the Quran, which is the Muslim Holy Bible. And so Muhammad and his followers conquer Mecca, they conquer Medina, they conquer most of Saudi Arabia, and they extend out. Islam spreads to all of the areas of the Middle East, including Iraq and Iran. But there's a problem. In Islam, there are several different groups. It's a lot like Christianity, where there are different denominations. So in Christianity, there's Roman Catholic, there's Lutheran, there's Calvinist, there's non-denominational, there's Eastern Orthodox. In Islam, there's also two different factions. The two main ones are something called a Sunni and a Shia. And I have a little diagram right here, and it shows some of the modern nations that are followers of these. Okay? Now, what's the difference between a Sunni and a Shia? There are a lot of big differences between them, but the major difference is who is supposed to be in charge. So in Roman Catholic, let's go back to Christianity. In Roman Catholic, they have the Pope, who is in charge of the church. In Islam, they had a person in charge. He was called the Caliph, which in Arabian basically translates to successor. After Muhammad dies, or in Islam, Muhammad ascends to heaven. But after Muhammad is gone, the Muslims, who are the followers of Islam, have to decide a new leader. And there were two ideas. Who's going to be the Caliph? Well, the Sunnis say it's whoever is the best leader. Whoever is supposed to be the best leader. And the Shias, on the other hand, said, no, it should be Muhammad's descendants. And this was the big split. And so Islam splits between Sunni and Shia. The Sunnis are going to be, for the most part, people who believe that a certain group are the right successors of Islam. They form what's called the Umayyad Caliphate, which is the first really big Muslim empire, which takes over the majority of the Middle East. However, the Umayyads were not able to conquer Iraq and Iran, which become the strongholds of Shia Islam. And so that's a big thing that Iraq and Iran share, is that the majority of Shia live in Iraq and Iran. Okay? But let's go. So, Islam has come onto the scene. And as history goes along, the natural borders of the different Islamic cities, Islamic countries, kind of continues to grow and change over time. But there is always this cultural divide between Iraq and Iran. And it comes down to nationality. Most Iraqis are what's called Arabian. Okay, they come from the Arab nationalities. Persians, people who live in Iran, are not Arab. They're Persian, or what they would call it, Farsi. Okay, so people in Iran don't speak Persian, they speak Farsi. Eventually, as we go through, the Ottoman Empire comes and conquers Iraq. They're never able to conquer Iran. The Ottoman Empire rules Iraq, with Iran being the border. Iran was controlled by a group called the Timurids for a long time. Eventually, Persia, as Iran was known back then, is sandwiched between two great empires. The Russian Empire in the north and the British Empire in the southeast coming up from India. And Iran is stuck in the middle. Iraq is still under the control of the Ottoman Empire. After World War I, Iraq is technically independent, but not really. Iraq becomes a protectorate of the British. Basically, they're a colony. And it's the same for that all the way through World War II. Both nations are under the control of the British. This does not mean that they were happy about that, though. The British in Iraq were almost overthrown, actually, by the Nazis. The Nazis actually sent soldiers by plane into Iraq to try and start a coup. This, of course, fails. So after World War II, both nations are trying to get rid of the British. And eventually, what happens is you have the two nations form, the nation of Iraq and the nation of Iran. However, the British, and also to a certain extent at this point, the United States, do not want them to just be by themselves because oil has been discovered in the Middle East. And so the controller of oil is going to be in control of a lot of different things. Iraq forms kind of a military dictatorship, whereas Iran also forms a military dictatorship under the rule of a guy called the Shah. A Shah is like a king. So this is in Iran. And for the next couple of decades after World War II, the Shah rules Iran. However, he was not very religious. Or to a certain extent, he was not as religious as some Islamic priests, who were called imams, wanted him to be. And so in the 1970s, the Iranian imams, led by a guy named the Ayatollah, overthrow the Iranian government. And this becomes very problematic for the United States because they take several people who are American in Iran hostage. Eventually, those hostages are released. But Iran becomes an Islamic republic. And they are a Shia Islamic republic. And they are one of the only Shia-dominated states in the world, especially in the Muslim world. Iraq, on the other hand, continues with its military dictatorships. They become under the leadership of something called the Ba'ath Party. I know, very strange. They didn't want to take a bath. The Ba'ath Party is led, eventually, by a very famous man named Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein becomes the dictator of Iraq. So you have two nations who are led by dictators. You have the Ayatollah, who controls Iran, and you have Saddam Hussein, who controls Iraq. And these countries, even though they are Shia majorities, the problem with Iraq is that the Ba'ath Party is led by the Sunnis, which is a minority group. And so you have a small minority, the Sunnis, about 1/3 of the population, controlling the entire country. And so they follow Sunni principles, and they go to war with Iran. This starts the Iran-Iraq War. There are a lot of reasons why the Iraqis and Iranians go to war with each other in the 1980s. The control of the Persian Gulf, the desire to destroy the Islamic Republic in Iran, but also national and cultural differences are a big reason why there's animosity between these two nations. Eventually, the Iran-Iraq War ends after a 9-year stalemate. Saddam Hussein, who is the dictator of Iraq, is so broke from the war that they try to invade Kuwait. This, of course, leads to the United States intervening and ending the occupation of Kuwait with the Desert Storm operation and the Persian Gulf War. And eventually, Saddam Hussein is overthrown in 2003 with Operation Iraqi Freedom. What is going on in modern day? Well, in modern day Iraq and Iran, you have a lot of issues. Iraq was one of the hotbeds of the ISIS insurgency because The Iraqis had gone from a Sunni in charge to Shia groups in charge. And since the Shia had been ostracized, they decided to take a little bit of vengeance. This isolates a lot of Sunnis. And a lot of groups in the Sunni Iraqi communities were one of the first groups that went over and fought with extremist groups like ISIS. That's not the only reason why ISIS was prevalent in Iraq, but it's one of them. And so Iraq has been divided for the last 10 years. You have the Shia government, which controls Baghdad and some of the southern regions. You have the Sunni west, and then you have another group called the Kurds who live in the north. I don't really have a lot of time to talk about the Kurds. If you have a question about them, put that in the comments below. In Iran, they have been up and down. They are still under the control of the Ayatollah. But it is technically a democracy in Iran. There's elections. Women are allowed to vote, which is not allowed in a lot of Islamic countries. But there's still a lot of press censorship. There's still a lot of secret police that try and get rid of protesters. What can we conclude from these two nations? Iraq and Iran are not really natural nations. If people were allowed to decide, you'd have them broken up into smaller states. However, history, geography, nationality, and religion plays a role in a nation. And it plays a role in the formation of a nation. As we look through the Middle East, we see that these factors can lead to very large empires. They can also lead to small nation states. As we go through the Middle East, we see the role that geography has and why it's so critical with understanding it. Because it shows us, when we look at a conflict in the Middle East, we see that it is a massively complex issue. It can't just be simply said, this is a religious conflict or this is a nationalistic conflict. There are tons of reasons why they are in conflict. And as we study through geography, we see the origin and also potentially we look for solutions. Thanks for watching, everyone, today. Your assignment for today is to either comment below with something that you thought was interesting in this video, or to comment below with a question or post it in the Google Classroom. Looking forward to listening to all of your feedback. See you guys tomorrow.